You ladies and gentlemen of the press have been less than honest reporting to the American people what's going on in this country.
The baby's out of incubator.
We're dealing with Hitler Revisited.
This is the Scott Horton Show. Libertarian foreign policy. Mostly.
When the president does it, that means that it is not illegal.
We're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years.
They don't know what the they're doing.
Negotiate now. End this war.
And now, here's your host, Scott Horton.
All right, you guys, introducing Jose Nino. He is the deputy editor over there at Headline USA, working with our good friend Ken Silva over there. And of course, he is a regular contributor at the Libertarian Institute as well. Welcome to the show. How you doing, Jose? Good to see you.
Oh, I'm doing great. Thank you for having me on, Scott.
Very great to have you here. So, man, I have to tell you, I'm really grateful for this article. I mean, I really love all of your stuff that you write for us. 30 years of failure, how US-Venezuela relations spiraled into military confrontation. But I'm just so appreciative of this because it's so in-depth, and you take us back and give us all of everything important we need to know that's happened since the late 1990s when Hugo Chavez came to power, and the different shifts in American policy overall and through the thing, and right up to the current day, the disputed election, the threats of war, and the attacks on boats in the Gulf, and every kind of thing. So as we are recording this on Friday morning, there are some indications. I don't know. I should be reading the 3 major papers every morning right now and making sure like what all leaks are coming out of the administration. But they certainly have sent a war force down to Venezuela, an aircraft carrier battle group. And we have reports of all different special operations command forces and who knows what, open leaks about CIA operations there. Looks like there's, I don't know, what, a 49% chance that the United States of America is about to launch an aggressive regime change war against Venezuela, when the president said, Jose, was that Maduro has, quote, offered everything. In other words, it's not like Iraq, where 6 months after the war started, they ran that piece by James Risen in the New York Times about how Saddam Hussein had tried to surrender. Here, the president admits that the guys tried to surrender before the war, and looks like we might just have one anyway. And I really don't know what to think about it, man. But I'm so interested in your take. But so first of all, I guess maybe can you inform us on your understanding of the latest in terms of America's position regarding Venezuela?
Yeah, there's definitely something going to kick off in Venezuela, and subject to speculation, the just amount of military naval assets just bordering Venezuela, to me suggests there's going to be some type of punitive strike. Okay. Whether it's against military facilities in Venezuela that allegedly harbored drug traffickers, or even a decapitation strike of the regime, is very likely on the table, to be honest, because of there's a lot of factors in play. You just don't move that many assets there for the sake of gunboat diplomacy, because originally I thought this was going to be like gunboat diplomacy, but it seems that they're trying to like escalate even further. Also, look at the broader geopolitical picture. The Russia-Ukraine conflict is not going well for the United States Ukraine proxy, and also the Chinese trade war. It looks like Trump is on the back foot there. So the U.S. needs to get on the scoreboard, and the logic in a lot of these defense circles and just DC in general is that Venezuela could be that kind of tune-up fight, if you will, that could get the U.S. back on the win column. They're expecting it to go like Panama or Grenada in the 1980s.
God, I saw where Colonel McGregor was on Tucker Carlson the other night, opposing this as harshly as he could and warning Trump against it. And that was what they were talking about too, was that you hear these people in charge running the Pentagon talking essentially like boys and saying, well, I don't know. We got to win one. We got to do something. We got to show how strong we are. And McGregor, who obviously was a full bird colonel in the U.S. Army and is a conservative and a tough guy, is like, you don't show strength just like randomly killing people. That's weakness, right? You're flailing here. That's not showing strength at all. That's pathetic. It's also murderous and criminal and horrible and wrong. But it also is, in a sense, amazing that anyone in charge thinks that's going to make America look tough rather than just making us look like George W. Bush, the bully, again more.
Yes.
Or Obama. I didn't mean to leave him out. Or Biden, for that matter.
Yes, this stuff is a form of like nihilistic, like sadism. It's just the strikes against these boats where there's like no proof whatsoever of these boats being linked with drug trafficking. Just shows how petty the like national security strategy of the United States has become. It's like no longer even subtle. Actually, even from like a regime change standpoint, like it engaging these acts of just rank sadism against like Venezuelan nationals on the high seas or just right off the coast actually makes it even difficult for like the regime change venture in Venezuela to work, because a lot of the Venezuelan population is just not going to have it. Like when you're just like randomly murdering people out in the sea.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, right? That what a way to soften up the Venezuelan people for this thing is just by painting America as this absolute murderous villain, right? This looming juggernaut over them, and make them all hate and fear us, especially fear us on the eve of the thing. So you would think if they want any kind of regime change like this, that part of the operation would be to try somehow, I know futilely, to make the Venezuelan people think that like, oh, good, finally Uncle Sam is going to come and save us from these commies, when they're just, as you're saying, they're just destroying any possibility of that by killing these random people. And Kyle Anzalone has one in the news section at the Libertarian Institute today about how the Pentagon admits they don't know who they're killing.
I just saw that too. Yes, exactly.
So there's a boat. And remember, the commander, the admiral in charge, was it the admiral or who was it that resigned over this? It was the admiral in charge of the thing, resigned last week, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and also clearly, yeah.
Yes, there's a lot of taboos actually being broken here because say what you want about the US grand strategy in Latin America since the end of the Cold War, when it's actually gotten on the win column, it's actually been through like the hidden hand, mostly through like these color revolutions where opposition forces can have like some degree of plausible deniability by campaigning on some local issue, but they have like a lot of backers in DC and the NGO consortium there. But in this case, it's just blatant in your face military action being used to try to like facilitate this regime change venture, and they're televising these hits. So like the Maduro regime is making hay of this and going on a lot of alternative media and going to the world to show like these people are engaging in just like outright murder. So they're losing a lot of the court of public opinion, not just like in Venezuela, but also like the world in general. So like the idea of like, for example, Maria Corina Machado wants like a international alliance to help facilitate this regime change. I mean, good luck doing that when you have like an administration that's just openly advertising its nihilistic and sadistic for punitive strikes against people that are not even convicted like drug traffickers or whatever.
Yeah. All right, now let's rewind some things here, man. You know so much about this. I'm so grateful again that you wrote this great piece for us. 30 years of failure, how US-Venezuela relations spiraled into military confrontation at the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org. And I know Kyle ran it on antiwar.com the other day as well. People can find it in the archives there. Not reprinted there, but linked in the viewpoint section there. Now, so I was making the case on the Provoked show with Darryl a couple of weeks ago that yes, they are commies, like not, I don't know exactly Leninist or whatever, but Hugo Chavez was to the left of the progressives by far, and his successor is also a commie. And so to most rational people who don't know a whole lot about it, they would just assume that that is the cause of all of Venezuela's problems. And then I was making the case that there's another major cause of Venezuela's problems, and that is America's economic war against them. America is not just our country. America is the world's superpower, the global empire. And they have essentially outlawed multinational corporations from trading with Venezuela in any substantive way. And so you could be a commie regime and still hire some French company to run your oil for you and do a good job of it. The Americans essentially through sanctions make that almost impossible. And then, so this is a huge part of the Venezuelan gang crisis in the United States right now, all of the refugees and all of this stuff and the destabilization of the country. And I'm just settling scores here, Jose, you understand? Someone in the comments said that I don't know what I'm talking about. And those sanctions didn't even start until a few years ago. But I remembered differently. And then I read in your article that George Bush started this sanctions war against Venezuela back in 2005, 20 years of economic war against Venezuela. So we all know that communism is stupid and doesn't work because Mises explained about why you need prices. And so like nobody's arguing that. But USA, when we're bragging about it, we remember that USA is number one. We're the superpower. And so when Washington, D.C. and the U.S. Treasury Department declares war on you, that ain't much less dangerous than when the Pentagon does. And that has been going on a very long time. So can you please take us back to the Hugo Chavez revolution and the institution of this leftist regime in Venezuela? Who'd they replace? How good or poorly did they do business? And how long has he been dead? How long has Maduro been in there? And what are the relative causes of Venezuela's decline and the relative excuses to attack them now?
So the Venezuelan regime, honestly, a lot of people across the political spectrum in the United States, I believe their political and analytical software is not updated. It's still stuck in the 20th century because they're engaging in Cold War era tropes. It's actually more of a hybrid economy that will situationally become very collectivist and expropriate certain sectors of its economy that are generally in control of like enemies of like the regime or rivals, but it will become like situationally capitalistic. It's more of a mixed economy that does have like price controls and currency controls, which are very misguided policies in general from like rational economic grounds, but it's not a fully collectivized type of Marxist economy, like a Stalinist centrally planned economy like the Soviet Union was. It has some elements of like third positionists because when Hugo Chavez came into power, you have to look at the context too. In the late 90s, Venezuela had nearly triple-digit inflation after a series of failed market reforms. And also they since it became like a petro state with like social democratic characteristics in the 70s, it's been mired with big spending issues, currency devaluations, and just a more stagnant economy. This is before Chavez came into the picture. For example, in 1998, there's a book called like Introduction to Economic Growth, and it points out that Venezuela had the dubious distinction at that time of being one of the few countries in the world that actually was poorer on a per capita GDP basis than it was in 1958. The only other countries where that demonstrated that trend in that time period were Nicaragua, which had a civil war, and then several sub-Saharan African basket case countries, and that was about it. So the model that was in power before Chavez came into the picture was already failed, and in fact, there were two failed coup attempts against the government of Carlos Andres Perez, who tried to implement these neoliberal reforms, and the bipartisan system that governed Venezuela from the 60s up until the mid 90s just collapsed by then. I mean, this country was in free fall. This narrative that you see being put forward by a lot of political pundits in the US of like a pre-Chavez Venezuela being this paradise. I mean, yes, it is like relatively richer, but it was already like trending downward to begin with. You got to look at things in the macro sense, not just like in a like short-term relative sense. So Chavez really campaigned against that system because of how he perceived it to be corrupt. And his system does have an authoritarian streak to it. And when he started regulating a lot of opposition media, like in the early aughts, that's when DC started to pay more attention to Venezuela. You have like the coup of 2002. The thing is that to note is that because the US was much more on the project for a new American century agenda, a lot of its resources were more focused on the Middle East. So Chavez, it gave him wiggle room to kind of maneuver and take advantage of the high oil prices of that epoch to build up like the state. It is like very similar to the previous order that governed Venezuela. It was like a petro state where they would use petroleum rents to subsidize certain sectors of the economy. The previous social democratic order mostly subsidized upper middle class and higher people, whereas the Chavista model was more lower middle class and below that it would subsidize. And it also would use the money, the oil rents, to try to forge alliances with Cuba and other countries to kind of create like a parallel bloc in Latin America that would challenge U.S. hegemony in certain respects and at least prevent the U.S. from completely dominating the region. Because you have to remember, Chavez was inspired by the likes of the Ayatollah Khomeini and Nasser in Egypt and Fidel Castro. He always saw himself as a revolutionary figure that's willing to chart an independent course and oppose U.S. hegemony. And then the Chavez regime took a more anti-Zionist line in the later aughts, as well as it became more pro-Palestinian, and that attracted a lot of negative attention from the Zionist superstructure that governs the U.S. And it didn't help either that Chavez also forged alliances with the likes of Iran and cooperated on several defense and economic matters. But in general, you can make a very strong case that there was economic mismanagement, and there are people within the regime and even certain members of the opposition that will critique the policies on a like constructive grounds. But there's been some forms of not just like official sanctions, but also other unconventional methods by the West to make sure that Venezuela would not be normally integrated into like the world economy, because a lot of people tend to fixate on like official legislation of sanctions imposed on Venezuela. But the U.S. Regime, it has become more sophisticated in how it will deplatform countries from basic trade routes, from payment processors, and engaging in commerce like through SWIFT and other mechanisms. Like the US government can use that type of leverage to convince other countries to not do trade with Venezuela or at least restrict it and make it really difficult and potentially seize Venezuelan assets that are abroad. And that's one thing we have to keep in mind because as I said before, many people still operate under the premise of like 20th century geopolitics and statecraft when the game is changing a lot. And one thing to stress, though, that now that we're in the era of great power competition, Venezuela has responded in kind to U.S. overreach by making these overtures to Iran, China, and Russia. And as a result of that, it has become a target for certain factions in the U.S., whether it's China hawks, whether it's Jewish supremacists in the Israel lobby that want to take a swing at Venezuela just for its connections with Iran or its championship of the Palestinian cause. It has created a whole assortment of actors that want to attack Venezuela. And to show this type of issue linkage, when the Trump administration launched the maximum pressure campaign against Iran. They also launched their very own maximum pressure campaign against Venezuela that was really, really tough from 2017 to 2020. And that's when you really started to see the hard power being used against Venezuela, threats of military intervention. And now this is just the next phase of it. We're no longer in the type of hidden hand color revolution type of politics. We're kind of going back to a retro futuristic type of politics that is kind of hybrid, where they have like a regime change agent like Maria Corina Machado, but now you also have the big stick of U.S. naval assets right across the sea that are ready to launch strikes against Venezuela.
Yeah. Right. Hey guys, Scott here for Mundo's Artisan Coffees. It's the Scott Horton Show flavored coffee breakfast blend. It's part Ethiopian, part Sumatra. It's really good. All you do is go to scotthorton.org/coffee and it'll forward you on there to Mundo's Artisan Coffees. Get it? They hate Starbucks because they represent the war party, of course. And so they're Mundo's and they support peace. And guess what? Scott Horton Show coffee is the #1 best-selling coffee at Mundo's Artisan Coffees right now. Just go again to scotthorton.org/coffee. Man, if you have any money, you should be buying gold with it. Central banks are hoarding it up. And if you need some, you should go to rrbi.co. That's Roberts and Roberts Brokerage Inc. It's my buddy Tim Fry. He's a really great guy. Him and this business, they've been over there for a very, very long time. And they will help you get your metals, and they will always do you right. That's Roberts and Roberts Brokerage Inc. at rrbi.co. All right, this episode of Scott Horton Show brought to you by the books I wrote. You can see them behind me there. Enough Already, Fool's Errand, and then Enough Already, and Provoked. And then, of course, one might have fallen down there, but I got Ron Paul, the great Ron Paul, Scott Horton Show interviews, and Hotter Than the Sun. See that one back there, over there, that way. Hotter Than the Sun, Time to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. That's all interviews I did all about nukes, and really great stuff. And I busted my ass on these things, and I've gotten a really great reception on all of them. They were all been endorsed by Ron Paul, and Daniel Ellsberg endorsed 2 of the 3 I wrote. He would have endorsed the 3rd one, I know, but he died too soon, unfortunately. Tucker Carlson says that Provoked is the definitive account. And in fact, that's what Glenn Greenwald and Aaron Maté said about it too. The definitive account of the new Cold War with Russia and the war in Ukraine. So maybe check that out. Hey guys, I have another podcast now, right? Yeah, me and the great American historian Darryl Cooper, that is Martyr Made. He's my co-host, and we host a show every Friday night. We might be switching to 2 days a week here sometime soon, but for right now, we're doing Friday nights live at 8 o'clock Eastern time on the YouTubes. Checked out our Twitter handle, Provoked Show. All right, so, man, there's so much there, but I want to rewind back to the coup of 2002 that you mentioned there. And this is something I'm not sure, you got so many great links in your piece. I wasn't able to track them all down, but I'm not sure if you linked to this, but people can find this. There is a documentary called The Revolution Will Be Televised that shows the entire coup. And do you have that in here? Do you link to that? You seen that?
Yes, I've seen it. I don't have that linked there.
Oh, okay. Well, so let me just describe for a minute, because it's really great. There's this, I think they're an American camera crew, like college students down there, and they're making a documentary about Hugo Chavez. And then the right-wing coup plotters arrest Chavez and run off with him and take over the presidential palace, I guess it is, wherever. And the camera crew is just standing right there. And the coup plotters just assume that, well, they're cool or they wouldn't be here. So I guess it's fine. And so they just stand there filming the entire thing. And then they got Chavez is on a plane to Africa or something where they kidnapped him and they're taking him overseas. And then he calls and lets them know that you guys, goose is cooked. Guess what? The walls of the presidential palace are full of a secret detachment of paratroopers loyal to Hugo Chavez. And the paratroopers come out of the walls of the palace and arrest the coup plotters and take them away. And the plane turns around and brings Hugo Chavez back to power. Like, holy crap. And the whole thing is on film. It's just amazing. And that's Bush, while he's getting ready to invade Iraq, he wants to pull, kind of a one-off here. And
Yeah.
Greg Palast had said at the time, and I'm fairly certain it was Palast was the source for this from the BBC, who said what had happened was they intercepted a phone call between Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi, saying that they were gonna, I forgot, either dump the price or ramp it up, one or the other that the Americans disapproved of. And since they couldn't get to Iraq for another few months, they said, well, let's go ahead and try to get rid of Chavez in Venezuela so they could counteract the effect of whatever Saddam and Gaddafi were up to, just as like this minor thing. And so he's got to go there. And then, of course, that completely failed. And I mean, what a spectacular coup d'etat and failure of a coup d'etat. And to have the whole thing on camera like that is just amazing to see. And then, of course, I think a lot of what you described about the economic war that came against them after that was a result of that humiliation. Oh, and I wanted to harp on one more point that you said too. Would you comment about whatever you want, but this is something that Palast also had said, and he knew a lot about Venezuela. He knew Hugo Chavez very well, spent a lot of time down there and such. And he had told me that all the oil resources there are just like under extremely rocky, barren land where Indians didn't even live there. It was never anyone's private property. The oil was always owned by the government. When it was the former right-wing government, as you said, the right-wing government pumped all that oil and they gave all that money to the rich and the upper middle class. The Hugo Chavez government was no more commie, other than in the sense that truly they gave that same revenue to poorer people instead of just the rich. That's the difference between the left and the right.
Different clients.
Yeah. And so, I think that's important, that like essentially, it's like in Alaska or whatever, where the oil is always claimed by the state first, and then they enter into a contract with whatever company to pump it. And you don't have to approve of that to just recognize that's how it's always been there. And then, oh, hell, one more Palast thing as I'm talking about this. I don't know if this footage was from 2002 or later. They keep trying to overthrow the government there. They've tried a few different times. And there was footage one time, this was from BBC Newsnight, where Palast has behind him the right-wingers, so to speak, whatever, relatively speaking. The right-wingers are protesting, and they got a pretty big crowd. And they're trying to do a move and overthrow. This may have been in 2002. No, I think this is a separate time. Whatever, it's 20 years ago. Leave me alone. But you got a pretty big crowd of people who hate Chavez and want rid of him. And Palast goes, look at this, dude. This is a pretty big deal. And these are the thing. But then he turns 90 degrees and you see behind him the freeway is got 1 million people. Right. Yeah. And he's like, this is the left. These are the people who support the regime. And the same kind of thing happened when they tried to do the Juan Guaido coup under Trump 1. And I tried to find this later and I couldn't find it. I swear Max Blumenthal had the tweets that had the footage where they had drone footage of, it must have been 1 million people who were coming out to surround the presidential palace to protect Maduro. Where it's like, yeah, it's the rich versus the poor. And there are a lot more poor. And they're on the side of this guy. And honestly, man, if you think about it, I think about just how much I detest the various American regimes that I have lived under my whole life here. But I'm always going to fight on the side of American independence against any foreign power, as though that could ever be a threat to us. But hypothetically speaking, we would always fight against the foreigners before each other. And it makes the same sense for the people of Venezuela, too, that maybe this guy's economic policies do suck, and maybe he brings on a sanctions war by the rest of the civilized world. But still, at least he's our guy. And as opposed to a foreign sock puppet installed by people who clearly, by definition, have foreign powers' interests in mind.
Yes, Venezuelan nationalism, has been a common denominator of its political scene, regardless of what regime has been in place since, I would say, the discovery of oil in like the 1910s. Whether you've had like dictatorships, the social democratic order, or Chavismo, that's been a continuous trend. It's very ingrained, and that's something that should not be underestimated here. Also, with regards to the talk of like the military intervention, you've seen a weird dynamic that even among the opposition, it's caused a fissure, because you have like the two-time presidential candidate Enrique Capriles Radonsky, who ran against Chavez right before Chavez died, and then Maduro after Chavez died. He's actually come out against like the idea of like a military intervention, and has even said that ultimately like these people in DC are just going to try to like foment a civil war. It's not going to be a clean thing. And that also the drug type of trafficking charges they're accusing the Venezuelan government are just spurious. And there are like factions on the ground of like the opposition in Venezuela that do have beef with the Venezuelan government. They have grievances, whether it's on economic policy or like the distribution of like the rents. But the red line is the military intervention, and it's caused like a huge fissure where really the monolithic support for this regime change intervention is among opposition. That's in South Florida, the expat community there that's just on their computer talking smack and just getting their minds warped by regime change propaganda from like the neoconservative and the Cuban set there. But it's really not as monolithically like supported in Venezuela. And I'd also tie into Iran with the 12-day war. There, you actually did see a kind of nationalism emerge there too, where some opposition forces actually and reformists actually kind of gravitated toward the Iranian state. So these type of punitive strikes do create rally around the flag effects.
Yeah. Well, and it is important too, back to, Iran and what you were saying earlier about, and I think this has got to be the key to the thing. Well, I guess there are two major choices, right? One is they just really pissed off the American empire by reaching out to the BRICS and doing everything they can to stick their thumb in the eye of the United States right when they should be kissing up, right? Which is a lot. And back to Palace. Palace also talked about years ago about, and you referred to this a little bit obliquely, but where Chavez was essentially trying to elbow out the IMF. And was telling Latin American nations, I'll give you loans at reasonable interest rates, and they won't be an excuse to gangsterize you out of your property. You just pay me back. It'll be fine. And they really hated that. So it makes sense that that's what they really hate about the guy. When I was Googling about the oil companies and Venezuela, I found a lot of stories where Houston is telling Washington, please lift the sanctions. No, not more sanctions. You're going to destabilize the oil business there. We're trying to do business. They're on the side of reason most of the time, or at least maybe that's just Chevron, and maybe that's just, Citgo gas. Because I also read a thing by Harrison Berger in the American Conservative magazine about how Exxon, Standard Oil of New Jersey, they've been pushing for regime change in Venezuela and sponsoring the think tanks that are pushing this agenda in Washington now. So maybe it's both of those things. But, again, Trump said he offered everything. So Venezuela obviously wants no beef with the United States. They're trying to give in on as much as they can now to prevent it. But I wonder what you think. Like, is there any kind of final straw here, or just Rubio got in the presidency here and he's the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor too, and so we're just stuck with Trump thinking whatever Rubio told him to think, or what is going on?
Well, on the oil thing, and here's another kind of paradoxical thing that's very similar to the point we were talking about Maria Corina Machado and how the strategy the U.S. is implementing almost like undermines what they're trying to achieve. If you turn this whole venture is just going to lead not to like a regime change, but actually like a kind of like regime destruction that will create a failed state. That is the worst environment for oil extraction possible. Right. You want to have like an actual like strong state structure that can actually like facilitate private enterprise and bring in foreign investment and engineers to extract the oil. Like turning into a war zone, that's just not going to work. And then this is what just shows how harebrained this is. Well, now to the Rubio point, the second Trump administration has become more Floridified, if you will. It has a stronger Florida influence, whether you look at Pam Bondi or Marco Rubio in this administration. So they're really catering to this weird Cuban Zionist accelerationist axis in the national security establishment that is going to take very punitive measures, especially against Iran and Venezuela. There's the issue linkage there. And this faction is very much in control, because when I look at the national security establishment in the US, I just see multiple factions where you have like liberal internationalists that want to go toe to toe with Russia. You got the China hawks, and then you have this kook Zionist accelerationist faction that will pact with another set of expats with grievances, whether it's Cubans or Venezuelans. And these guys are very much in control. And with Rubio in the mix as Secretary of State, of course, he's going to have disproportionate influence in terms of where he wants foreign policy priorities directed. And I also add, too, with this type of regime change venture in Venezuela, it'll create a refugee crisis, and that's going to make everybody in Florida that loves cheap labor, that wants to turn Florida into just a Latin American style latifundia with cheap labor. Oh, they're going to love that when that refugee crisis happens, so they can import a ton of people and just continue the displacement of American workers as well.
Yeah, people, I think, are very right to point out that the Democrats like all this immigration, legal and illegal, because it creates future Democratic voters. And I think that's right. But the other half of that is big business. And
cheap labor, cheap folks.
But yeah, they need that downward pressure on labor by scaring the people at the lowest end of the labor force into thinking that, boy, I better not ask for a raise now or I'm going to get replaced. And all that, of course, is to counteract the effects of inflationary money. And because there's upward pressure on all prices everywhere. But if you're running a business, upward pressure on wages is your biggest problem. And so if you can import a bunch of cheaper workers, then you do that. And the overall, consequences for the population at large, are going to have to wait.
Oh, it's a regime bonanza when you think about it, because it satisfies many factions of the regime. You already have people like Matt Iglesias, who is a president of Cuban Jewish extraction that's called for 1 billion Americans through mass migration. This guy is an ostensive liberal. And these type of people, it's perfect because you get to satisfy the regime change fanatics, or those who want to stick it to Venezuela and stick it to any country that challenges Israel, as well as also just bring in a bunch of cheap labor to satisfy the business lobby and people that want to promote diversity. You're hitting every regime change, regime faction checkbox there, and it's a bonanza for them. And that's why, and it's honestly why you don't really see a lot of people talking about Venezuela, to be honest, because of most of these people, frankly, they don't want to say it publicly, but they actually kind of like the idea of having this regime change regardless of how it goes, because one way or the other, they're going to get a bunch of refugees that they're just going to integrate into the economy and continue this fake economy going.
Yeah. Well, good. And then that'll be an excuse to bring more troops out into the streets to assist ICE in deporting them all. It'll be great.
Yep, strategy of tension. Yep.
Yeah. Government will just grow and grow and grow from all directions.
Yes.
Yep. All right. Well, listen, man, thank you so much for being part of the Institute and all your great journalism and this great piece that you wrote for us. It's 30 Years of Failure, How US-Venezuela Relations Spiraled into Military Confrontation, by Jose Nino, and he's deputy editor over at Headline USA, and you can find him regularly at libertarianinstitute.org as well. Thank you, man.
No problem. Thank you for having me on, Scott. It's a pleasure.
The Scott Horton Show is brought to you by Roberts & Roberts Brokerage, Inc., Mundo's Artisan Coffee, Tom Wood's Liberty Classroom, APS Radio News, and Dissident Media. Subscribe to the show at scotthorton.org, scotthortonshow.com, libertarianinstitute.org, youtube.com/Scott Horton Show, iTunes, Spotify, etc. And check out my books, Fool's Errand, Enough Already, and my latest, Provoked, How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine, at amazon.com. And I'm serializing the audiobook of Provoked at scotthortonshow.com and patreon.com/Scott Horton Show. See you next time.